Good morning. I'm Alberto Ibargüen. I'm president of the Knight Foundation. I'm thrilled, delighted, very, very happy to be back where I grew up, to be back in New York, and I will be going back to where I live now in Miami very, very quickly. Thank you for the weather. We have for decades at Knight Foundation funded journalism programs, journalism education programs, and now are funding lots of experiments in figuring out how communities will communicate with each other, how people will learn, how, in the words of Jack Knight, people will be informed so that the people may determine their own interests. There is no better thing for us to be doing with the funds left to us by John and Jim Knight. We are especially pleased to be in New York with media minds like the ones gathered here. Things are changing fast enough. I told Norman it was so fast that the program advised us that we were getting into the mind of Bloomberg's Norman Pearlstine, and that has already changed. We work with many of you who are in the room. I know that NYU, Columbia, Associated Press, City University of New York are all organizations with whom we're proud to work. International Center for Journalists, I just saw Seth Posner. There are lots of you, so welcome to you, a special welcome to you. I want to turn the microphone over to Peter Price, who will introduce our guest. Peter.
Having spent most of my career stateside of the church-state equation, I found it the kerfuffle, if it was such, when the Norm was announced as coming back to Time Incorporated, and perhaps the church would somehow be corrupted as the system supposedly is changing at Time Inc., where I started my career. Knowing that culture, I think there's no danger to the corruption of the church. I think the sanctity of journalism will be alive and well at Time Incorporated. I think it's noteworthy, particularly that where Norm spent most of his early career, maybe most of his career, at Dow Jones, the Wall Street Journal, the tradition there always was, and with Robert Thompson at the helm of News Corp still is, that a journalist sits at the top of that organization. The other model, I guess, is Bloomberg, where an executive was always sitting at the CEO seat in the organization, and Time Inc. always had that hybrid model where you had this division of the editorial side and the business side. I really think in the new converged world of media and journalism, it frankly doesn't make any difference. If you put out a good product and you have something that people want to read or see, they will do it. How you do it and how you execute on that is the challenge. So like all of you, I'm anxious to hear what Norm Pearlstine has to say. Alex?
Thank you, Peter. Welcome to you all, and it's my great pleasure to be here with Norm. We haven't sat like this since he was the executive editor of the Wall Street Journal and I was a reporter on the media at the New York Times. And
I was so happy when you went to Harvard.
Before we begin, I think it's very important for me to say a welcome back to Kathy Gay. Those of you here probably know that Media Minds was her brainchild, and if you know Kathy Gay at all, you know that she is a very, very hovering mother. She cares deeply about this breakfast series, and the inaugural one a few months ago was one that she had very much looked forward to running and to certainly being present for. Unfortunately, she slipped, fell, and cracked her head and was not able to be here for that. But she is here today, and Kathy, welcome back. I'm not going to try to, repeat the headlines that I think you've all been reading in the past few weeks about the Time Inc. situation and Norm's coming to Time Inc. In this new capacity as content editor. I think that one of the things that caught my eye in particular was your boss and friend Joe Rip's comment that Time Inc. is going to no longer be a magazine company, it's going to be a media company. And let me ask you, given what Peter said, and I think that Peter's got, you know, his own point of view on this, and it has a lot of merit. But if you were looking at what Time Inc. you expect Time Inc. to be, you know, 2 years from now, and you could be optimistic, what does it look like? What does it look like? But be realistic too. You know the institution,
right.
You know Time Inc., you know the magazines.
Well, you know, 25 years ago, about the time that our spin will take place, late spring, was when Steve Ross got together with Dick Monroe and put Time Inc. together with Warner Brothers. And, you know, it was a very innovative company at that time. People forget that, you know, Jerry Levin in those days was responsible for HBO. They had a strong interest in ATC that became Time Warner Cable. And when Life magazine was in trouble, Dick Stolley went off and started People. And it was a company that I think was very much known for innovation. When Joe talks about it as a media company rather than a magazine company, it's certainly not to denigrate magazines. We have a lot of magazines, we print a lot of magazines, we sell a lot of magazines, we make a lot of money from magazines, and I think we have gained market share in the last year in the face of difficulties. I think we'll continue to gain market share, and magazines will be an important part of Time Inc. At the same time, if all you're doing is looking at magazines, if all you do is think of yourself as primarily a print company and that your digital efforts are essentially line extensions of those brands and are meant to look and feel like, you know, magazines on a tablet and so forth, I think you miss extraordinary opportunities and you miss things that are obvious to many of the people in this room. And so I think when Joe talks that way, it's really about trying to foster a spirit of entrepreneurship and of innovation where you're willing and able to consider all kinds of things, many of which were frankly difficult to do as a division of Time Warner, because there was Turner, there was Time Warner Cable, there were all kinds of institutions that you wanted to play nice with, but it was very hard to do as opposed to trying to do it yourself.
You know, Norm, as I was sort of preparing for this, it occurred to me that what's about to happen at Time Inc. and what has already happened at Time Inc. really would make a great HBO miniseries. It has all the drama, all the, you know.
Certainly the last 25 years could make. I'm glad you think it's better for video than for print.
Well, I think that the idea, though, is that here is Time Warner spinning off the print publications, which are, at the moment anyway, the weaker, much the weaker. Mm-hmm. They are putting you in a position to have an IPO second quarter of next year. The third quarter results for Time Inc., the operating income was down. It's going to be very difficult to find a way to deal with a successful IPO without getting those numbers up. And you've got a brand new CEO for Time Inc. who has looked at this, and his basic response, as far as I can tell, is to blow it up, blow up the culture, and try to really shake things up. And you are a big part of that. Getting rid of the editor-in-chief position was a big part of that. Mm-hmm. But that puts a lot of pressure on this new team in a very short time to have results that are going to be scrutinized very carefully in just a few months. What are you going to do?
Well, there's a lot to be done, for sure. And you know, while you're making long-term plans, there's budgets to be met that are due in a few weeks, and so we're you know, doing what a lot of people do. We're sitting in a lot of meetings, having a lot of discussions about it. I don't know all the intricacies of the IPO. There's still a lot of things that need to be discussed between corporate and Joe. I think until you know the specifics of that, it's hard to judge it. But in terms of what we do with Time Inc. as a company, I think that we have to do both. We have to continue to be as effective and as efficient as possible in producing the brands, the products that we already do, but we also, I think, have to be able to show ourselves and show the public capacity to move and move quickly to embrace some of the very exciting things that are are possible in a digital age. I was just talking to one of my colleagues here about one of our magazines, All You, which is coming out with a way using Digimarc to allow for shopping through a magazine. And that's just one example of the kinds of things that I think we need to be looking at that are in no way inconsistent with the brand or with its quality.
Let's talk about your new job title and what
Sure.
it means, and what it means to have blown up that
Sure.
editor-in-chief job. When I came to New York in the 1980s, Henry Grunwald was the editor-in-chief, and he reported to the board. He didn't even report to the CEO.
Correct.
And then Jason McManus succeeded him, and
I sat on the board.
he sat on the board
Right.
and was was reporting to the board. And I think that it is fair to say, I've certainly, colleagues of yours at Time have said, that when you came in as editor-in-chief, you really restored what had been lost under Jason in terms of the steel and prestige and authority of the editor-in-chief's
Sure.
position.
Sure.
And now that's going to be gone, at least in the form that it existed. What is going to be different
Sure.
now?
Right. Well, first of all, let's talk about what was great about the title of editor-in-chief and everything that it implied. It implied a commitment to editorial standards, to editorial integrity, and to editorial independence. And I think all of those are very well established at Time Inc. They're very much a function, frankly, of the choice of editor. If you choose the right editor, those things should take care of themselves. If you don't, then you get into real trouble, and choosing editors is something I will continue to be very much involved in. I think that if the change in what we were doing was one where you were putting editors under publishers who were responsible for selling ads, that would be of real concern to me. The idea of having editors report to business leaders, and there are, we have now 3 leaders who run 3 different parts of Time Inc., which has over 100 different titles, is not all that different from what happened in 1997 when I stopped reporting to the board of Time Warner. I actually thought it was a much more dangerous place than reporting to Don Logan, who was the CEO of Time Inc. So in that respect, I don't see all that much difference. What I think is the question really about the editor-in-chief role as it was at Time Inc., and I was a part of it, is it was symbolized by the mitre, which was passed on from editor-in-chief to editor-in-chief. And then last week, Martha Nelson cut it up in small pieces and gave it to people at her going away party.
You literally had a mitre?
We had a mitre. But it felt...
Such is the mind of Time.
Right.
Yes.
But I frankly felt it was more a yoke than a mitre. And I'll give you an example. When I arrived at Time Inc. in the fall of 1994, I was taken to Jason McManus's office and was told that had been Luce's office from the time this building was constructed in '59, and that every editor-in-chief sat there. It was in the southwest corner, and it's a spectacular office. Don Logan came down to see me the first week I was there, and those of you who know Don, for him to get from the northeast corner to come visit me was something he thought about seriously before making that kind of move. That was a hike for him. And so he came down and he said, you're new here, I'm new here, coming up from Birmingham. I've got this suite up in the northeast corner, and why don't you come sit in the other office there and we can actually talk to each other. And I said, that sounds like a good idea. And at that point, Dick Stolley and Jason McManus came to me and said, you cannot leave this office. This is the office of Henry Luce. It symbolizes everything about church and state. You need to be as far away from the CEO as possible on this floor, or you will undermine everything that church and state stands for. And so, coming from the outside, I wasn't about to challenge that then. But in thinking about it coming back, it seemed to me that it suggested a kind of layering, a kind of remoteness, and it excluded editors from really thinking very much about their customer. And I think that's a serious mistake.
This was a position, though, with real power. It was not just a consultative one. I'll give you an example, and I think I'm correct, the Matthew Cooper moment.
Yep.
That was an editor-in-chief decision by you.
And I'm making those identical kinds of
So
decisions this week as Chief Content Officer.
Would that be a decision of the Chief Content Officer?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. It is very much, and Joe Rip made this clear, that as Chief Content Officer, elements of the Editor-in-Chief job are rolled into it, including responsibility for best practices and for procedures. And this week, I mean, I've been involved with Sports Illustrated on 2 different stories, both of which happen to involve anonymous and confidential sources, in which...
Like your book.
Yeah, it's
There you are.
deja vu all over again. I would just add one thing, and that is that I've always thought that editors, sometimes in wanting to lump business as a distinction from editorial, make a mistake. Because in my own file of failed ideas, I always argued, I've tried it with Peter Kahn, I tried it with Logan, that circulation actually ought to report to the editor and not to the CEO. Because it seems to me if you ought to have a metric for editors, they ought to be judged by renewal rates, by subscriptions, by newsstand sales, or whatever measure is appropriate, whether it's uniques or page views or video downloads. And while that is something I've never been able to persuade anyone of, the idea that an editor thinks of himself or herself as a marketer, thinks of himself or herself as someone who's actually responsible for that customer's experience seems so obvious to me that I've never understood why it wasn't encouraged.
Well, but part of the editor-in-chief job was to insulate the kind of decision-making from things like advertiser interests and to create a credibility and a confidence. Let me just ask you.
And you do real damage to the brand if that is undermined in any way, and I have no fear of that happening.
So what would, for instance, you not do? I mean, let me give you an example. I know you worked at Forbes for a while, and you've expressed admiration for Forbes. Can you imagine a Time magazine that looks sort of like Forbes?
Well, I can imagine I can imagine products that look like some of the things that Forbes has been doing. When you go to the magazine itself, there's some parts of it that I think are very good. There's some parts of it that probably I wouldn't be comfortable with, but that's really an editorial judgment, I think. The idea of not just having letters to the editor, but having involvement by people who identify with Forbes as they do with their contributors, I think is really quite exciting if done right and done well. I don't see a big difference between the ads that they run and pretty clearly identify as ads on their homepage and in Forbes.com from an advertorial in a magazine.
Well, do you see?
I do think labeling is critical.
How do you see the evolution of the concept of native advertising at Time Inc. as you try to? I mean, look, the situation is, it seems to me, is that you've got a narrow window to make Time Inc. a successful spin-off company. Mm-hmm. You have revenue problems. Revenues have gone down. You've got operating profit problems. You can't deal with that but one of two ways. You can either grow revenues or cut expenses. And my guess is, and I'm not going to try to pin you down about this, but I'll be very surprised if there's not a significant layoff.
Well, I think
because you've got this looming and you can't grow revenues that fast.
Well, look, you need any successful enterprise, especially one that is publicly held, needs to have cash flow for investment. That seems axiomatic. And how you get that is a function of many different things. I mean, if you look at the News Corp example, Robert Thompson sitting there with a big pile of cash. His newspapers, I think, are a pretty tough business all over the place. And if you're relying on Australian television, that has risks of its own. In our case, I think we first of all have to look at if we are being as efficient as possible with all the things that we're doing. And There's been a lot of changes at Time Inc. over the last decade. The People editorial budget, I think, is roughly half what it was when I left 8 years
Really?
ago. Now, it's still, by anybody's standard, a significant budget that shows every week its ability to do extraordinary journalism, and part of the reason for that is because it takes advantage of all of the access to information that comes with the digital age. I think fundamentally at core, and my friend Justin Smith, who just joined Bloomberg after we had spoken for quite a number of months about how we were going to work together, my friend Justin had said in a note to the Bloomberg staff something that I embraced totally. He said there are two kinds of media companies: those that are willing to embrace the future and, with all of its uncertainty, recognize that there are opportunities to be successful with it, and we can point to some examples of it. And then there are those that are determined to maintain everything that they've done for long periods of time, only doing it less well because the resources won't be available. And I think we, if you're asking, can you change everything at Time Inc. in 4 months, you'd be foolish to try. As I say, we have great magazines that need support, need encouragement, and we're going to increase market share in that business. But at the same time, I think everything that Joe is pointing toward is how do we get the efficiency, how do we get the funds to invest in our future? And I think you'll see good examples of that very quickly.
One of the things, Joe Rip is an old-time hand, and of course, as are you. And one of the things he said in this transition period is that the executive suite at Time was the place where ideas went to die.
It's a velvet coffin. I think velvet coffin is not a bad way to look at it, yeah.
The thing is that I think it is also well known that Time Warner has treated Time Inc. as a cash cow, has basically, in some respects, throttled its abilities to act on ideas. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but I think that there is a sense that now at least Time Inc. is going to have control of its own money, its own profits, and it's going to be able to make these decisions for itself, provided there are these profits.
Yeah. Look, I don't think it was a decision that said, we're not interested in print, but compared to the other opportunities for using capital at Time Warner, publishing had trouble winning those battles. An example would be that over the period when I was not there, the websites for Sports Illustrated, Money, and Fortune were all given to Turner for management. So it became CNN Money with Fortune as kind of an asterisk, almost impossible to find. Sports Illustrated, separating its digital product from the magazine, was not a great way to try to build the future of that brand. It made great sense from a Time Warner perspective because you were strengthening Turner Sports, you're strengthening CNN, and you were looking at this and saying, these are all parts of the same company. From a shareholder perspective, that's the best place to put it. But I think from a Time Inc. perspective, we're going to be able to do a whole lot with those brands and do it very quickly that we couldn't do if we were part of Time Warner.
When you look at what's coming, do you have a sense yet of how much debt Time Warner is going to saddle on your back?
I do not.
Seems unfair utterly to me that they would saddle any debt on you guys.
Well, I think sometimes operating with debt this may, I learned a little bit at Carlyle, even though I never did a deal there. Sometimes debt can be a plus for you. I don't see how you spin off a company from a company the size of Time Warner without attaching some debt to it. I think it's not in their interest to have a failed IPO. It's not in their interest to make it so onerous it doesn't work. It's their shareholders who are getting the stock in this new company. But it's a balancing act. And I'm happy that I don't have to participate in that negotiation. But I have every confidence in Joe Ripp. He left being CFO of Time Inc. to become CFO of Time Warner. He was then vice chairman of AOL. He knows an awful lot about how that place works.
When you look ahead at these new products that you want and the evolving products that you already have, where are the lines that you see that you do not want to cross? I'll give you an example of one that particularly is hot at the moment, and that's the concept of native advertising. Where do you see what's permissible and where do you see what is not for a company like yours?
Yeah. Well, it varies from brand to brand in my mind. If you're, and it's not to suggest that some magazines have a higher or lower standard, but that they're different. And if you think about the customer needs of some of our lifestyle magazines, they're quite different from the customer needs of a publication like Time or Fortune. And I think we need to be wise about that. I am not so much troubled by native advertising.
Well, how do you define it? How would you define it?
I think it's an advertorial, and that they've been in magazines forever. The difference is that it's in a typeface and a font that no editors ever read it, but customers do. And if I look at the homepage of the New York Times and see the way advertising is interspersed with what you might call a table of contents, I have trouble understanding what all of the concern is about giving advertisers space to tell their story. I think it's all about labeling.
So labeling is the issue as far as you're concerned?
I think it's, yes. And if you are labeling properly and you turn off your customers in the process, you'll know that you've made a mistake. I mean, a great thing about a digital age is you have instant feedback about what you're doing. And there was nothing that decreed that news and advertising had to be together at all. There may be products that you want to have no advertising in and which you want to get income from other means, either from events, from charging for subscriptions. So I don't think it's one size fits all, but I certainly think with a number of the Time Inc. brands that properly labeled, giving advertisers the same kind of access to customers that they have in the print product seems natural, not anathema.
So you are, in this position you're in, Chief Content Officer, effectively the standards guy? I'm
a standards person. We have standards people all over the place. We have even in our CNN Money group, a joint standards and practices for that site. We were fighting about something last night with it.
Well, let me ask you about something that's a thorny question for, at the moment, Bloomberg, but really for everyone who has ambitions to be a serious news organization covering a place like China.
Glad I got out when I did on that one.
But
I didn't see it coming. I didn't know much of it.
What did you think of what appears to be the decision not to run the story?
Well, I haven't read the piece, so I don't feel I'm in a position to say. I've spoken to Matt, who says the story was just not ready for publication, and that they're still working on it. I take him at his word. He's a man of great integrity and decency, and if he says it wasn't ready and he wants more work, I think that's an editor's prerogative. But I've not read the piece.
Okay, well, let's leave the specifics aside and just talk about the theory, because the Times article, anyway, quoted, unspecified, unnamed Bloomberg people as saying that Matt said that he likened this to covering Nazi Germany, and that you had to make compromises in order to keep access. That's an interesting and genuine concern. He said it was not a business concern; it was a journalistic access issue.
Yeah.
But I think that at the same time, when you have as obvious a business interest as Bloomberg had, where does and presumably Time would have, hypothetically, where do you find your comfort zone here?
Right. Well, there's no one size that fits all. Most journalistic organizations don't have much skin in the game in China. I mean, if you get banned, you get banned, but it would not be considered material on anybody's filing with the SEC, from what I can tell. Even for Bloomberg, frankly, the amount of business in China is not enough that it would make it, that it would be worth jeopardizing the reputation of Bloomberg News. I don't know the actual numbers. It's very hard to understand the finance. But if I'm right, there are about, I don't know, 2,000, 2,500 terminals in China, which is significant. I mean, it's probably, but it's not from a, it's, you know, for a company with 315,000 installed terminals, it's not enough to jeopardize your news organization.
Well, there was another report about how Bloomberg tagged some stories for not being published.
Yeah. Well, if you're being banned, that's an interesting question, whether you want to try to do any kind of pre-censorship or whether you just say all of our customers need to be treated the same. Instinct tells me that I would opt for the latter, but I'm not, well, I just don't know the details.
Well, you were the guy that created the Asian Wall Street Journal.
Correct, and got banned all over the place. You know, and in different ways. In Indonesia, there was shoe polish that was put on the articles. In Taiwan, they would cut out any references to Mao. In Korea, the KCIA would just come visit you in your hotel room. And in the Philippines, the issues would just disappear, and when you complain, they'd say, we don't know what you're talking about. There's no censorship here. It must be our postal system. But no, you know, look, Lee Kuan Yew has, you know, made it very difficult in Singapore by having rigorous enforcement of their libel laws. And those laws are different from the laws of the US. I do think that any organization that operates internationally has to stipulate that it's going to have to live by the laws of the countries that it circulates in. And if he doesn't like those laws, it shouldn't distribute there. Where it gets tricky is in those countries where rule of law is not particularly well established and the practice is rather, you know, can be draconian. I mean, in the case of Bloomberg, we have never heard anything officially from the Chinese government complaining about the article last year on the wealth of Xi Jinping's family. We just know that the website was blocked the next day, and we've not gotten back in since then.
The Chinese doublethink about Bloomberg is really quite fascinating. I know that one of your top correspondents there teaches courses in journalism at Tsinghua University.
That's right, exactly.
And the courses that he's teaching are based on reporting that is banned by the Chinese government. It's you know,
it's a big, complicated
whatever.
country.
Yeah.
It's,
you know,
look, I don't. I mean, it's kind of funny, but I think with China, it's really the people who are trying to penetrate those markets who have to take a long view. You know, IBM did not advertise in Fortune for 6 years after a cover story on Lou Gerstner that he took offense about. So it's not only China that, you know, punishes journalists for writing tough pieces. That happens. I mean, it was a big deal at the Wall Street Journal before I got there that General Motors pulled ads after stories it didn't like it.
The name of this series is Media Minds, and I really want to try to get inside your mind as you look forward. You've been a very successful media executive in any number of areas for a long time, and you're in a very dynamic period. When you look ahead, what concerns you? I know, let's not say there are lots of opportunities out there. I think that goes without saying. But what are you worried about?
Well, we have not yet come up with a business model that that can support much of the journalism that I think is important to a free society. I think we've come up with business models that can make for profitable media companies, but I think that's a risk. We have certainly organizations such as ProPublica, which Paul Steiger, who's here, started that are one approach to that kind of thing, but I think it can't be the only approach. I have lots of concerns about, particularly about how people are informed about their towns, their counties, their states in terms of getting the kind of information that allows them or enables them to really participate in citizenship. I think that if you ask me the things that worry me, individuals can go out and get great stories, probably more easily than ever. And we've always had examples of freelancers breaking very big stories. I mean, Cy Hirsch did Me Lie as a freelancer and sold it to a newspaper in St. Louis. But you know, if you look at the number of state houses that have little or no coverage these days, if you think about how difficult it's been for even something like Patch to get started at AOL at a local level, that's where I would say my concerns are. I'm not that concerned about whether media companies will be able to develop a profitable model, and then there'll be a question of whether those same companies will want to pursue the kind of journalism that has been so important to our country over the last century.
Do you see any promising models that would address these local and regional and state kind of reporting issues? I know that at Bloomberg you were in charge of an operation that focused on government.
Yes, and a lot of it was about the municipal bond market, which was a way in, because that was, you know, if Bloomberg's at its best when it provides information to people who can trade on it or that a transaction can result. And Bloomberg is doing some very good stories at the state level, but their audience is a very different audience from, you know, the audience of local residents. And so in terms of examples, there are some early ones. There's some, I've not looked at them lately, but some of the services that Jane Bryan Quinn has been working on in Connecticut seem to have promise of going in that direction. Again, I say that without having looked over the last year or so. But I think that to me is a major challenge for us.
When you talked about making having different standards for the different publications that you have, where do you put something like People? I mean, People magazine has been a huge success, a huge popular success. What some people may not understand is that People magazine took itself very seriously, its journalism very seriously. It is not, it is a, you know, it's reader friendly, but it's very serious.
There's no better reported publication than People that I'm aware of.
So where does People fit into this? Because it's certainly an audience that is rich and opportunistically, you know, I would think very desirable.
Well, first of all, it is a very successful publication, and it's a very successful website as well, people.com. I think an interesting question to ask, and I say this to someone who wasn't there, was when TMZ was started, not by Time Inc., but by Telepictures, which was part of Warner Brothers within the Time Warner empire. I think people looked at each other and said, is this something Time Inc. should have done? I mean, TMZ will pay for content, will pay for tips, for stories. People would say, well, that's a line we're not going to cross. That's a kind of journalism we won't do. And I would accept that and respect that until the next time a book excerpt comes in and the agent says, how much are you going to pay me for first serialization rights? Because I have a little trouble distinguishing between paying for the book excerpt, paying for photographs of Angelina Jolie's children that go, where the funds go to a charity in the name of the person providing the pictures, and what TMZ is doing. I think that's a tough one to resolve.
Well, I mean, do you expect to have to, is that a cultural change that's going to come?
So far we have not gone the TMZ route. You wouldn't want to do it with the People brand. Whether you would find a place in the organization for it or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm a reader of TMZ. I love TMZ. And so I'm sort of asking myself, if I love it that much, why would I say, oh, I'd never never have touched this.
I think you could create a new publication or a new online service called Page 7. Let me open it to,
Sure.
to you in the audience. This is a good opportunity to talk to one of the people who really has been through a lot and has got a really big challenge ahead. If you have a question, just indicate, and the microphone will come to you.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and thank you both. And thank you for the probing questions, Alex. That was great. This is a probing question with a little preamble. I've been in the book publishing industry for about 25 years in different roles, and I'm very sympathetic and was impressed by your concern about business model, because certainly that's the basic question in a lot of media. It used to be that content was scarce, relatively speaking, and you could make a business on it. Now content is ubiquitous. I mean, you can publish yourself, you can get whatever you need. So why in the world would you want to be chief content officer?
Yeah, it's a great question. Content is ubiquitous. It sometimes feels like there are more writers than readers, you know, especially in the book business. But I do think there's also opportunity for doing things differently, and I just think it's never been a more exciting time to be in this business than right now, and to be fortunate enough to be at an organization like Time with the kinds of resources that it has, including the human resources, gives me more reason to believe that we're going to find opportunities than anyone else. But let me suggest a couple of the kinds of things that we might want to look at. Right now, it has always been true at Time Inc., at least as long as I can remember, that the brands were what it was all about, and the corporation really was just a custodian of the brand, so you really kept them quite separate from each other. You know, recently, Fortune had a story about personal finance that came from the editors of Money in This Old House. It was kind of interesting to see that, a little bit surprising at first, but certainly interesting. From an advertising perspective, close to 100 million women look at a Time Inc. magazine or website or mobile app a month. Yet we have never tried to sell that group itself, but rather we talk about the number of women who read People, the number of women who read Real Simple, the number of women who read InStyle. Given the fluidity that comes with digital products, is that something that we ought to be focusing a whole lot more on as a company? I think and if so, do we create products that can cut across some of those brands in terms of where the content comes from? You know, when you think about books, I mean, one of the problems I think for a lot of news organizations is how you justify the space for a story for a discrete audience. I think about when Rick Atkinson was at the Washington Post and did a 4-part series on IEDs in the early days of the Iraq War. I think it was 17,000 words over 4 days. And I have to believe that the number of Washington Post readers in print who got through those 4 has to be some subset of 1%. If you had put that together as an electronic book from the Washington Post with the credibility that comes with that brand, that might be a much better economic model than killing trees to try to put it into a print publication for an urban audience that, you know, did not have the staying power to get through it. So those are kinds of things one ought to think of.
That's your idea of long-term, long-form journalism in the future that would have an audience.
It's an idea, is that you have the ability to say, well, who's the global audience for this piece of work? And I think organizations like Time Inc. can figure that out better than most.
Yes, sir. Over here.
Norm,
Here's trouble. Hi, Alan.
sheet with 2 questions. One is, you talked about digital content. I'm wondering what your strategies in terms of video in that relationship. And secondly, I don't know if Mike Pearlstine is here, but I was intrigued by your comment about measuring editorial success in relation to readership and et cetera, and the whole strategy that Forbes has employed now with their editorial content, which gets compensated, the digital, in relation to amount of traffic that
Right.
generates from it.
Well, let me go to the second question first. I think these are early days, and you have to try a lot of different things, and I think Forbes has done some very interesting work. Some of you may know Lou Dvorkin and I have a long history with each other, and I did in fact work with him on his business plan for True Slant, which I think we brought to you at one point. You were, in that point, busy with paid content, either buying or selling. I'm not sure which, but I have followed Forbes very closely from the time Lewis folded True Slant and took that whole concept with him. And it's one that you have to take a look at. You have to ask if everybody were doing it, whether it, is it a flavor of the day, and that it then just becomes sort of another tool that is interesting but not defining, or whether it is in fact an important example of the way we've migrated from the one-to-many model that since Gutenberg has made editors feel really important, to one where customers are deciding what they are going to experience. And certainly with the amount of traffic that now comes in through a side door rather than through search or looking at a specific brand, that's going to be a really important question. With regard to video, absolutely. I mean, we are now, I'm not the first one to note this, that this coming spring, I think the graduating class from college will be the first class that was born in the internet age. It never thought about distinctions between print and video, and even between advertising and news, the way that I did growing up, or you did. And I think it's really worth taking a hard look at the way video can be used to help storytelling, and there are just some great examples of it. It was a great growth area for Bloomberg in business news. It's a leader in terms of video online. And I think that it's a place where we can grow very quickly at Time Inc.
I know that there are questions probably on this side of the room, but I haven't seen any hands, so I'm going to go back over here. Dick.
Norm, I found your observation about the idea of having moved, or proposed having moved, the responsibility for circulation in print editorial fascinating. Would you agree that in the digital publishing world, circulation has, although it's probably not been acknowledged, evolved into a joint business editorial responsibility?
Sure. I mean, Nick Denton probably was one of the first who, was, and people raised their question about the idea that his journalists would be paid on the number of clicks that their stories got. I think from an editorial perspective, that can raise some concerns, because it does drive you to a lot of heavy breathing, and it can lead to wretched excess in the process. But there ought to be, the idea, certainly online, of measuring traffic is something everyone does. I mean, the technology allows you to count.
And even in the most traditional organizations, if you've got social media in the editorial group, social media in the old world would have been considered a circulation function.
Yeah, I think that's correct. It is.
Yes.
I think it's worth, go ahead, I'm sorry, Steve.
Go ahead. No, you finish your thought.
I just think it's worth keeping in mind that these are still early innings, and that the technology is moving very quickly. I'm probably at this point much more focused on mobile than I am on websites. And one of the things that surprised me is that there's just a handful of the Time Inc. publications are using HTML to allow responsive design. They're still designing for specific for specific devices and so forth. As you will recall, Dick, and as Paul will recall, as recently as 1985, less than 30 years ago, we were putting out the Wall Street Journal with manual typewriters, 10-ply carbon, and 6-level teletype, sending stories to Chicopee, Massachusetts to be keyboarded a second time before we were just getting rid of hot lead and going to cold type paste up. And that's less than 30 years ago. Google was founded in '98, and when it went public in 2002, Bill Gates was still questioning whether search mattered. You know, Twitter came a few years later. The iPad was introduced in 2010. That's less than 4 years and has totally changed the way we consume information. So, you know, when you start thinking about where we're going, you have to just sometimes, the benefit of being really old is that I can remember every one of those dates and how shocking it was to the system when we introduced a front-end system into the journal, and Glenn Mapes, the front page editor, had to give up his paste spot. That was a very serious moment, and I think when we start thinking about everything that's going on now, we just have to keep in mind how much, you know, just something like great voice recognition might very well change the popularity of mobile apps. I mean, if Siri had an older sister, I could fall in love. You know, it was a little smarter too, but you know, but you can just see it out there. You can almost touch it, and I think that's what makes it so exciting to me.
They didn't even give you electric typewriters?
I got no, absolutely not. Yeah. Steve, sorry.
Thank you. You know, you expressed concern, a lot of us share, that there won't be a business model to support certain kinds of journalism that you mentioned, local, city hall, state government, and so on, and there are other serious kinds of journalistic subjects that I think you would agree might not be supported by business models we see right now. There are, however, not for Time Inc., other ways of supporting and sustaining quality journalism.
You just got $3 million from McGraw-Hill.
I did. That's for business journalism, and we're gonna do long-form business journalism. Yeah. But my question really has to do with other models, philanthropic models. We have Alberto here. Government models, even along the NPR, BBC line, can be very effective forms of journalism, and a lot of local journalism is being done by what started out philanthropically diversified, Texas Tribune, Voice of San Diego, MinPost, St. Louis Beacon, and so on, doing very, very good journalism. So can you imagine that this country will get to the point where it says there isn't a business model to support certain kinds of quality journalism, and we have to go much more to some more publicly financed form of journalism?
Wow. Well, I think a whole lot of other things have to happen politically before you get to that point, because I think the winds now are much more toward why are we funding PBS,
Yeah.
And why can't NPR find more private money and so forth. But do we get to that point at some point? I can certainly, it may be something that starts at a local level or starts at a state level. You know, stranger things have happened in my lifetime, so well, what about, I don't rule that out.
What about carving out a section of journalistic enterprises that can be considered nonprofits and therefore accept contributions that would be tax deductible, hypothetically? I mean, that to me is a...
Listen, in the wake of Citizens United, be careful what you wish for.
Yes, sir, down here.
I'd like to ask you to reflect on your experience at Bloomberg and discuss how news fits into the Bloomberg strategy and world as opposed to selling terminals.
Sure. Well, I had a great time at Bloomberg. I was not a part of the news department, but I worked very closely with it. I reported to the CEO, Dan Doctoroff, and we didn't know what a chief content officer was when we thought up the title. It ended up allowing me to do a range of different stuff. But I would say that from Michael Bloomberg's earliest time, he wanted to be in the news business. Part of it was defensive. He saw Bloomberg as being very threatening to both Dow Jones and Reuters, and he felt that if Dow Jones withdrew its news feed, he would be in serious trouble in terms of building his business. And so in 1990, he went to Matt Winkler, who'd worked on a front page profile of Bloomberg for the Wall Street Journal for me, and offered him this job. And I remember Matt came to me and said he was quitting to start a news organization. And I said, well, who the hell would ever work for you? And it turned out we all did it one way or another. I think Bloomberg does extraordinary work. Its primary mission is speed and accuracy that enables people to make investment decisions, and that's where a lot of the resources go. But from Michael Bloomberg on down, there's always been a desire to do more than that, and reputation and influence have been important to him. It's why he started Bloomberg Radio in '92, television in '94, websites, Bloomberg Markets Magazine, why he bought Businessweek in 2009. I turned it down twice after looking at the book on it, feeling that I couldn't figure out a way to get it profitable as a weekly business magazine. And Mike had a much more expansive view that said, I'm interested in having a larger audience than just those traders know what we do. I want to have an outlet for some of our best work. And every time I've done something that looks like just branding or lead generation, it's actually added to sales of my core product. And we're seeing some version of that. Forbes tells me that all of the traffic it has online, and I think ComScore had it at 27 million last month, has led to an increase in subscriptions. So I think that philosophy of Mike Bloomberg's probably makes sense. In terms of the quality of the journalism, the real frustration for most people who work at Bloomberg is that a broader audience doesn't see so much of its quality work. And we've tried different things through syndication, through video, through webinars and so forth, and they make some difference, but they have not yet succeeded in having a really broad audience see some extraordinary journalism that Bloomberg produces every day.
How would you handicap the likelihood that when Rupert Murdoch eventually goes to his reward 30 years from now, that Bloomberg would buy the Journal?
Oh boy. Look, I didn't think he was going to buy Businessweek, so what do I know? Michael Bloomberg is a contrarian. He enjoys doing the opposite of what people think. When he was asked if he wanted to buy the Financial Times, he said, I buy it every day. And I think part of it really is just a question of how quickly newspapers sort of just migrate into much more of a digital space where he might, there's always been a bias at Bloomberg to building, not buying. And I think if it gets, the FT at this point, I think, has more digital subscribers in the US than print subscribers, or it's roughly 50-50, pretty close. At that stage, I think, given all of the electronic capability that Bloomberg has for distributing content, extraordinary communication system, it may be that you decide that Rupert, having written off, close to $3 billion of the 5.6 that went with the purchase of Dow Jones, may be perceived as not having been aggressive enough in his write-downs. So
interesting. Yes, right here.
Hi, Norm. This is another question about the nonprofit sector. Yesterday, the Foundation Center came out with a report. They said $2 billion has flowed in from the philanthropic arena to support all kinds of journalism that's on a nonprofit model. We don't have customers, we have readers. It's a very different kind of thing that allows us to do the journalism that you talked about that needs to be done. My question is about Time Inc. and what responsibility do you see as a major media company to interface, support, encourage the growth of the nonprofit sector, or is it competition? How do you plan to help this, because the journalism industry is in a crisis in terms of what it's delivering?
It's a great question. My personal view, and you know, there was not a whole lot of philanthropic journalism going on when I left Time Inc. 8 years ago. It's amazing what's happened in a very short period of time, and you know, based on 10 days of work, and I know less now than I did 10 days ago. My instinct would be to be very open to wanting to print, to link to aggregate from great content wherever it comes from. I was talking to Paul Steiger a few days ago, who was telling me about the number of pieces that ProPublica had already had published in Time, and I was embarrassed that I was unaware of that at the time. So, you know, if you got great stories, give me a call. We're interested. You know, the work that you did, of course, we talked about at Bloomberg, where there's a lot of interest in coverage of sustainability, of the environment, and so forth. And I think, you know, there will be people who will want to support operations like yours, but as you know, it's not a slam dunk.
Yes, sir.
My understanding of the old Time Inc. model is that business didn't know what editorial necessarily was doing, and if an advertiser came to them, they could say, you know, we don't know anything about it. Now that they will be working together, do you think there are more opportunities for advertisers to put pressure on the editorial side?
Well, I don't think the relationship between publishers and editors has changed. And there are pretty clear standards and procedures that keep the publishers out of the editorial business and vice versa. So I don't see where reporting to a president of the lifestyle group as opposed to an editor-in-chief up on the 34th floor changes that dynamic at all. I think what you get into now is just the ways in which new technologies can make you question some of the practices you've had. I had one last night, and I don't think it's a betrayal of any great secrets to talk about. Money Magazine does a terrific survey called Best Banks, and it appears first in the magazine and then goes up on the website a couple weeks later. Seeing the results of the print product, a couple of the banks that did very well in this survey wanted to buy the ads surrounding that product in its web iteration. And the question was, do you let the top banks do ads that are adjacent to this survey, you know, in which they get to give you their version? And we had some real discomfort with it on the grounds that, you know, one of the things we do in magazines is try to keep the ads, and this I consider actually a good thing, is we keep the ads separate from the content. So if you have a Chrysler ad, you don't put it next to a Chrysler story, and sometimes that's really to the benefit of the company as much as it is the reader. So, you know, we're still talking about it. I think I'm kind of torn between, you know, this discomfort with that kind of adjacency ad trumpeting, you know, an arrow saying, see this survey, here we are. But if it's already been in print for a couple weeks, it's a little harder for me to justify the idea that in a digital format, you can't do it. And I suspect we'll end up with some kind of a compromise that says, yeah, you can have an ad, but you can't own the space. But that's one we're still working on. So these are the kinds of examples that I think make it an exciting time to be there, but where the answers are not going to come easily.
Last question, Harold Burson.
10 years from now, what do you think the daily newspaper landscape will look like?
I want to distinguish for the, you know, there may be a couple of national or global brands that whether in print or digitally are distinct from what most newspapers are. I think it's increasingly difficult to support a daily print publication. Maybe it's a Sunday, maybe it's 3 days a week. I think 10 years from now, there will still be an audience of people who prefer print. They're going to probably want bigger type than now exists. My constant battle with Josh Tarango at Business Week is the 30-year age difference between us is reflected in about 4 pica of type. But I think that I think newspapers have a much harder time than magazines do in terms of a physical product. But that in both cases, the advertisers are probably going to even migrate faster than the readers toward different ways to get their message to customers. So that may very well force not only paywalls, but it may very well be that print products are kind of an elite product for people who really want to pay a lot of money for that content. And they'll want to read it anytime that it's available 24 hours a day. So the physical print product becomes less and less important.
I'm sorry to say we've come to the end of our Media Minds time for this time. Kathy insists on finishing on time.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm grateful for that.
Norm, let me say
Thank
good
you.
luck.
Thank
I
you.
really, it's important.
For
to
good
succeed.
luck.
And now,
Don't ever minimize the importance of luck.
well, I
It's
believe
much
in it.
better to be lucky than smart.
Miriam Banakaran is going to say a few words on behalf of Gannett.
Well, I just, on behalf of Gannett and USA Today, I wanted to thank you guys all for coming. We're in the business of serving our communities, and one of those communities is you. I think there's no more exciting time to be in the media business than today. Maybe interesting would be the more apt word, since that's a double-edged sword. And really, Norman, it was excellent. Thank you so much for coming. I know you only just transitioned into your new role, so we were sort of wondering how that was going to work out. And
Me too.
and we wish you immense luck. We've all been quite carefully watching what's been happening at Time Inc. And with that, I'd like to thank Kathy, who's been an amazing partner. We're so glad she's actually physically here with us today. And thanks again for coming.
I just want to say 2 words, and that is that I've been moving very slowly for the last 2 weeks. I didn't want to trip. I also want to do some shout outs. I want to thank Alex, who has been a long time friend, and I'm so grateful to him for accepting the invitation to moderate. I want to thank the Knight Foundation. I want to thank Gannett. They're so fantastic to work with, and I work with so many people, and they are both really at the top. And then I want to thank my board, and particularly Peter Price, who's just been doing so much for me and helping me so much. And I don't want the morning to go by without a special shout out to Madeline Cohen, who is my colleague and she deserves it loud and clear. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.